Welcome to the Political Economy of the Environment. Today's episode is about building natural assets. Building natural assets involves thinking about combining two objectives. One is protecting the environment, and the other is reducing poverty. And building natural assets is where these two can intersect. Sometimes poverty reduction and environmental protection are presented as if they were opposed to each other, like there's a trade-off between the two. But what I want to talk about today are ways that these two can go together, and indeed in some cases maybe have to go together. And I'm going to talk about 4 strategies for building natural assets. One of them's investment, or adding value to the stock of natural capital. The second is redistribution, or democratizing access to natural capital. The third is internalization, or rewarding benefits that people provide to others by virtue of their stewardship of natural resources. And the last is appropriation, or defending the commons, converting resources that have been treated and mistreated as open access resources into common property of communities, or in some cases perhaps of the people of the world as a whole. So first, let's think about investment strategies, strategies for adding value by investing in natural capital. As one example, let's think about the restoration of damaged ecosystems. The picture I've showed here in the slide is of the results of a project to restore mangroves that were damaged in a hurricane on the Oaxaca coast of Mexico back in the 1990s. The mangroves were critical to providing habitat for the fish on which local communities depended in a lagoon. This is called Laguna Mantialtepec in Oaxaca. And it's also critical for protecting the coastline itself. And when the hurricane ripped through with such intensity that it uprooted the mangroves, the local people got together and went and got mangrove seedlings from elsewhere and replanted the mangrove forests, restoring that damaged ecosystem, and in that respect, investing in natural capital. A second example would be soil banking, where it's not a matter of just restoring damaged ecosystems, it's actually a matter of making existing ecosystems richer and more productive and more resilient than they were before. For example, the development of terra preta, the dark earth of the Amazon, which is anthropogenic soil that was created by past activities of indigenous farmers who would partially burn biomass, take the charcoal that resulted, pulverize it, plow it into the soil, and it turned out that by doing so, they enhanced the fertility of the soil, they enhanced its ability to retain water, they created a better habitat for soil microorganisms, and they created deeper and richer soils than were there to begin with. That's an example of investing in natural capital, and those kinds of investments, as both these examples illustrate, can not only protect the environment, but also reduce poverty. A second set of strategies involves redistribution, or democratizing access to natural capital. It involves transferring natural capital to low-income individuals and communities as a way both to help protect the natural capital and to reduce poverty. And this is, of course, more controversial than investment because it involves moving capital from some people to other people. But it's been a really important phenomenon over human history, including in the 20th century, when some of the most important economic transformations in the world were unleashed through redistribution of natural capital. This is what happened in East Asia after World War II. It happened in Japan under the leadership of the U.S. military occupation there after the war, headed by General Douglas MacArthur, in which a very thorough land reform was undertaken to transfer land from large landowners, large landlords, who previously had used tenants to cultivate their land and had received most of the crop in return, to the actual tillers of the soil. And the reason the U.S. occupation administration decided to institute such a land reform was to try to break the back of the most nationalistic and reactionary forces in Japanese society, the landlords, and create the foundations for a modern and democratic society by democratizing access to the single most important natural resource in agrarian societies, land. Similarly, an equally far-reaching land reform was undertaken under very different political circumstances in mainland China, led by Chairman Mao Zedong of the Communist Party. Again, land was taken from the large landlords who had cultivated the land by means of tenant labor and hired labor, and transferred to the actual tillers of the soil. And in so doing, agricultural productivity went up and people's livelihoods were improved. Another example of redistribution is the creation of the extractive reserves in the forests of the Amazon that was proposed first, among others, by the leader of the rubber tappers, Chico Mendes, after whom the first extractive reserve was in fact named. These are reserves where local people who have sustainably been harvesting rubber and other products from the Amazon, like Brazil nuts, for often generations, are allowed to continue those activities, but the forests are protected. Their reserves, they're protected from deforestation by cattle ranchers or others. By creating extractive reserves, in effect, the Brazilian government was redistributing rights to land, providing more secure rights to the local people who were engaged in extractive activities. A third strategy for natural asset building is internalization, or capturing benefits, rewarding what economists call positive externalities. So an example of activities that produce positive externalities would be the cultivation of shade coffee in Central America and other parts of Latin America, like Peru, where coffee is grown in the traditional way in mixed forests, where there are taller trees that loom above the coffee trees that not only help to sustain coffee production, the shade is good for the varieties of coffee being grown, but also provide habitat for wildlife, including for neotropical migrant birds, the kinds of birds that come up to North America to breed in the summer months and then winter down in the forests of Central and South America, many of them shade coffee forests. So for example, the certification of bird-friendly or shade coffee undertaken by the Smithsonian Institution, among others, is a way of certifying that coffee has been produced in environmental conditions that provide this positive externality. And that certification system becomes a way in which people like you and me can choose to buy coffee that's grown in shaded conditions rather than in crop monoculture, where the forests are destroyed and all you have is one species, the coffee trees, growing and being blasted with pesticides to protect them from the pests that flourish in those monocultural plantations, etc. Instead, we can buy coffee from places where we know that habitat is being maintained for neotropical migrant birds and other species. And in doing so, we can help both to protect the environment and to improve the livelihoods of the small farmers who engage in that form of coffee production, thereby reducing poverty. Another example is the certification provided by the Forest Stewardship Council, which certifies forest products coming from, among others, small forest-dependent communities in Mexico and elsewhere around the world as having been produced in ways that are environmentally sustainable, where the trees are being extracted at the same rate at which new wood is growing, so forestry can remain productive over time rather than places being deforested and gradually the forest stock on the planet being reduced. And again, by certifying timber as having been produced in this way, we can provide information to consumers that allow us to preferentially purchase sustainably produced timber that's coming from places where all the environmental benefits associated with maintaining the forest, including wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, hydrological benefits, etc., are being sustained. And in so doing, we can also improve the livelihoods of the communities that are sustaining those forests. The final strategy is appropriation, or defending the commons, and this involves establishing rights to assets that were previously treated as open access resources. So for example, when the environmental justice movement here in the United States and around the world seeks to combat the disproportionate exposure of low-income communities and communities of color to toxic hazards, including industrial air and water pollution. In effect, what's happening is those local communities are saying, you know, that air and water that you're treating as an open access resource that you can just dump into without restraint, actually, that belongs to us. That's our asset. And we want to limit your ability to treat it as a sink for the disposal of your toxic wastes. That's a form of natural asset building. It's building rights to natural resources in the hands of low-income communities, and thereby both protecting the environment and improving people's well-being in those communities. A final example of appropriation on a larger scale is price and dividend climate policy. Policies that convert the limited carbon absorptive capacity of the atmosphere from being an open access resource into which anyone can dump carbon at no cost to a resource that actually is considered and treated as being scarce, and therefore that commands a price. People have to pay to use that resource, and by having to pay, they have an incentive to limit their use of the resource, thereby diminishing the rate at which carbon accumulates in the atmosphere. That kind of limitation, through putting a price on using carbon space, generates resources. And if those resources are distributed back to the people as equal dividends to every woman, man, and child, the result can be both reducing poverty, as low-income people receive dividends that are paid disproportionately by the richer people who use more carbon, and at the same time, it can help to protect the environment. So all of these strategies, investment, redistribution, internalization, and appropriation, are strategies by which we can pursue together the goals of protecting the environment and reducing poverty and inequality at home and around the world. Thank you very much.